Hello, my name is Louise Clarke. I'm the Monitoring, Evaluation and Learning Manager at IDS. Today I'm going to talk to you about some of the key concepts and tools for stakeholder and power analysis that we use to help us think about our policy influencing strategies. Our learning objectives today are to go through a brief introduction to theory of change and causal pathways, understand how stakeholder analysis supports policy influencing, and explore different types of stakeholders and their multiple perspectives and roles. We will then share a series of methodologies to help you conduct your own stakeholder mapping exercises to explore different dimensions of power and influence. These are specifically the alignment influence matrix and network mapping. The outputs from this session will be to do your own alignment influence matrix. To start thinking about how evidence shapes policy, it's useful to reference the spheres of control, influence, and interest. These are often associated with the outcome mapping methodology. On the left-hand side, we have the sphere of control, which is our outputs, the things that are in our control in terms of how we spend our project funds to support change. So this can be the generation of evidence, but also the activities, events, training that helps to share that evidence in the world. Moving along, and in the center, we have the sphere of influence. And this is really about changes in behavior and is very relevant to the conversation on stakeholder that we're having today, because the sphere of influence is about who changes and how, who can we reach with our key messages, and how do we expect them to react to those messages to influence and shape their behaviors towards policy decisions. The policy decisions ultimately feed into the sphere of interest, where we hope to see broader developmental changes in systems and societies and positive outcomes for the communities and populations that we work with. The spheres of control, influence, and interest are a useful way to start to think about causality and pathways of change, and think about how it is that what we do influences our broader audiences, and that in turn leads to broader levels of social change. A more structured way of thinking about causal pathways is to develop a theory of change. We're not going to go into a lot of detail on theory of change, but this is a brief overview of the approach that we use at IDS. Firstly, it's important to be clear on why do you want to use a theory of change. This could be as a planning tool. It could be to communicate what you are doing to key stakeholders. It could be an exercise to bring stakeholders together, and it could be to design your monitoring evaluation process. So before you set out on a theory of change process, it's clear to have those objectives in mind. Once you have that, we move on to developing the impact vision. What is the change that your program is aiming to bring about? What is the goal of your advocacy campaign or the policy shift that you're hoping to see? Once we're clear on our impact vision, and I often use the analogy of a map, and the impact is our end destination, we can move on to understanding the context dynamics, which is really about mapping the terrain that we have to cover to reach that destination. What is the context of the system? Who are the key stakeholder? What are some of the cause and effect of different issues and dynamics within the context? Once we've really understood that terrain, we can start to imagine how we'd like to shape it. What are the main outcome areas that we would like to work towards as a project or initiative? And this also is strongly linked to changes in stakeholders and how they will shift their practices, attitudes, and behaviors in response to new evidence. Once we've been through those stages, we can start to think about some of the different causal pathways that will link us from our sphere of control through our sphere of influence and ultimately to our sphere of interest. there will be different strategies and different pathways that you will apply, and these will often overlap and hopefully reinforce each other. Once you've done all that, it's really important to then step back and ask yourself, what are some of the assumptions we're making at every stage along the causal pathway when we think about how actors may respond to certain types of evidence or engage with certain types of activities? We generally make assumptions, and it's really important to have those clear so that we can challenge ourselves, but also so that we can come back and learn to improve our strategies based upon what we believe is working most effectively and what is not. And finally, we would link this to an evaluation plan in terms of understanding how effective we've been in achieving our ultimate vision. Today, we're going to really be focusing on this third step around understanding context dynamics. So one tool to commonly used to understand context dynamics is the problem tree analysis. And you've probably already reflected on the context of the system which you aspire to achieve change and the different dynamics that you're engaging with. So I just want to emphasize the importance of stakeholders and the relationship between them to these contextual dynamics, and that working with those stakeholders within that context and within their reality is really key to shifting those evidence use behaviors. So if we move along to talking about stakeholders, there is a tendency to talk very, very broadly, both about stakeholders in themselves, but also about generic groups in terms of national governments, local governments, civil society organizations, academia, media, where in reality, these are all very, very different. There's a lot of nuance and a lot of different ways of looking at these broad stakeholder groups. One way might be to think about how they fall, how we work with them. So stakeholders may be our partners, in which case we have a very close relationship, but we may also be trying to influence our partners or support them to build their capacity, or they may be also building our capacity and an understanding of the local context. Moving slightly further out, we have target audiences. Who are the groups that we really hope will engage with our evidence? Who can we reach directly through our networks and the networks of our partners, and those who are most likely to respond to the evidence that we're generating? And then finally, we have a more distant group, which is the end users or beneficiaries of policy. We may not have a direct relationship with them, but they are key to our thinking in terms of our policy influencing and representing their voices in those processes. It's also really important to think about how stakeholders operate across multiple levels. There will be people active in local and regional contexts, as well as national and international. And there are often a lot of assumptions made about how those different levels connect and how generating evidence at one level may be able to inform policy at a different level. So it's really important to have those levels clear, and to where you're making assumptions about linkages across those levels, that those linkages really do exist. Stakeholders are called stakeholders because they have a stake. They're not impartial, and they can promote or inhibit the access and use of evidence depending upon invested interests and where new evidence may challenge the status quo. So it's really important, and we'll look at this with the alignment influence matrix to understand stakeholders' own perspectives around the evidence and issues that we're addressing. And beyond this, there are always implicit and often quite explicit power dynamics with and between stakeholder groups. And it's also always useful to be clear about that. And even though we may have good intentions, what our own power dynamics may be with some of the groups that we're working with. So when we start to question our assumptions about how our target audiences engage with evidence, we can start to ask ourselves some questions. You know, what do you hope will change as a result of your evidence? Who is it that you expect to use your evidence? And who do you expect them to share it with? It's unlikely that policy change will be a result of one person engaging with one policy brief. So what is that context? How will they access it in terms of formats and medium? And will all the stakeholders want to access evidence in the same format? And if so, what different formats do you need, and how do they reinforce each other? What actions do you expect people to take as a result of engaging with your evidence? And do you expect them all to act in the same way? And which of these target audiences can you access directly and through your networks? It's really useful to have these questions in mind as you make your influencing plan, to make sure that you're grounded in the reality. And this depends a lot upon the stakeholders that you're working with, the relationships that you have with them, and the relationships that they have with the broader context. So now we're going to look at two tools for stakeholder and power mapping: the alignment and interest matrix, to identify how different stakeholders are aligned with our research ideas and the problem we're trying to solve, which is a tool to help us identify potential partners, audiences, and beneficiaries. Network mapping is another tool that's based upon the idea that change happens as a result of building relationships. And it can help us to understand power dynamics amongst the actors that we want to influence, as well as develop strategies to build our relationships and partnerships. So this is the alignment influence matrix. It's a very simple tool, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with it already, but I cannot overemphasize the value of using this simple space to get people talking and to really break down some of these generic groups into very explicit actors within your context. So essentially we have an X and Y matrix. The x-axis is alignment, strong and weak. The y-axis is influence. And as you can see in this exercise, projects go through and think about who are the relevant stakeholders in their context and where they sit. And the conversation both on who are the relevant stakeholders and where they sit in this matrix is really very valuable for project teams to think about their influencing strategies. It helps us to think about the specific groups that we're working with, and then we can look at, once we have these people, these actors onto the map, we can think of where we can see strong alignment and strong influence. These are really key potential partners or allies. Where we see strong alignment but weak influence, maybe we need a strategy to build that influence, maybe creating networks, or how can we work with those groups to build their capacity to influence the debate around a specific issue. Where we see weak alignment and strong power, these are key audiences and people that we want to engage with our research and hopefully influence their thinking so that they move along towards the stronger alignment. And when we have weak alignment and weak power, these are probably low priority stakeholders, but important to keep in mind because positions do shift as we go through projects. This example here we have developed using Mural, so we decided to color code each of the quadrants of the matrix. It's absolutely not necessary to do so, but it was useful to demonstrate how different actors sat within each of these quadrants. The second tool I'm going to share is network mapping. And this is a really useful tool once we've identified the stakeholders with the alignment and interest matrix to think about the relationships between them, to generate insights into the trust and power, and really highlight the importance of building relationships as a key strategy to shape policy with evidence. So, it can help you understand how is it that your network and relationships can help you reach your intended audiences, and have a look at where you maybe don't have direct reach to influential actors, how you could reach them through the network, and where you need to strengthen or build relationships in order to do that. It can help develop strategies to create alliances and reinforce key messages, and where potential tensions or conflict of interest might arise. It also adds to the understanding of power within the network, as different groups can control the flow of information depending upon their position in the network. So when designing a network mapping exercise, it's important to be clear which actors are most relevant to your vision of change and what are the different types of relationships that exist between these. In the context of shaping policy with evidence, it's likely to be information flows that we're interested in, but it's also other types of relationships can provide some really interesting insights in terms of belonging to unions or similar cooperative structures that will facilitate that flow of information and trust. And then we're really looking to understand how evidence flows through the network and what are the key positions that are able to block or amplify our evidence and expand its reach to other influential actors. So that gives us a different dimension on power, because power is about having the position in the network rather than just who has the largest organization. So that you could find some really key allies who are amongst smaller organizations with pivotal network positions who have strong potential to support with your strategy to shape policy with evidence. It's also important to reflect upon your own organizational role within the network and that of your partners, as there's a tendency as the organization doing the network mapping to put ourselves either in the center, because these are all organizations that are connected to us, or possibly to leave ourselves out because we want to look at the network without us. So that's a conversation to have. With all of these tools, there's no right or wrong answer. The real key part is the conversation that takes place as you sort of go through the exercise, and then really to reflect on what are the insights that this mapping provides for your policy or your strategy to shape policy with evidence. Thank you. So this presentation links to exercise in the workbook on the alignment and influence matrix. You also will have access to the mural space if you want to try out any of these tools for yourself. We would really love to hear your experiences of using this tool and what how this can apply in your context. Thank you very much.